My day always begins exactly the same way, a tradition carved into the very stone of my existence. At 5:30 a.m. sharp, the low, mechanical buzz of my alarm echoes through the quiet of my small apartment in Denver, just as it has every single morning for the last 2 decades. I don't have one of those fancy smart home systems that gradually raises the lights or plays soft forest sounds. No, I still rely on a basic clock that does its job without any fuss. I rolled out of my narrow bed, my feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. There are no heated marble tiles in this place, just honest, aged with that creaks under my weight. A sound full of character that reminds me exactly where I am. I shuffled toward my small kitchen, walking past furniture that most people in this city would have probably donated to Goodwill or left on a curb years ago. My coffee maker is a dinosaur. It's actually older than my son's career as a pilot, but it still brews a decent, strong cup of joe that hits the spot every time. As the steam rose from my favorite chipped mug, I stood at the counter and glanced at the small stack of mail that had accumulated. It was mostly just the usual stuff. Utility bills, a few flyers for local grocery sales, and nothing that would ever scream executive lifestyle to a passerby. What those envelopes and bills didn't show, however, was the reality of the direct deposit that hits my bank account on the first of every month like clockwork. That amount is $48,000. With that kind of monthly income, I could easily afford a massive mansion in the most exclusive parts of Cherry Hills Village. I could be driving a top-of-the-line Tesla, and I could be wearing designer suits that cost more than some people's annual rent. Instead, I choose to drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic and I do my clothes shopping at Target. To my neighbors in this modest complex, I'm probably just another retiree who is carefully scraping by on a tiny pension. The truth is a lot more complicated than a pair of faded jeans. In my professional life, I served as the regional director of Peak Horizon Energy, formerly Rocky Mountain Renewable Energy. I spent my career overseeing massive wind farms that stretched from the plains of Colorado all the way to the California coast. I managed budgets that were large enough to fund entire small cities, and I signed off on deals that involved more zeros than most people see in a lifetime. But the moment I step through the door of this apartment, I'm just another guy in comfortable clothes who prefers simplicity over spectacle. I've always believed that money is a tool, not an identity, a lesson my parents, a janitor and a seamstress, drilled into me from the time I could walk. The morning silence was eventually broken by the vibration of my phone on the laminate counter. My son Leo's name flashed on the screen. "Morning, Dad." His voice came through, sounding warm but carrying a distinct undercurrent of something else. Nervousness. "Hey, kiddo. You're up early for a pilot," I said, leaning against the counter and taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Actually, that's why I'm calling," he said, pausing for a second as if he were searching for the right words. "Chloe's parents are visiting this weekend. They really want to meet you." I set my mug down. "That's nice, Leo. I'd like to meet them, too. They're very successful business owners," Leo continued, and I could practically hear him adjusting his posture on the other end of the line. "They own the Sterling Restaurant Group, 8 locations across the state." There was another long pause, the kind that makes a father's heart ache just a little bit. "Dad, just, dress nicely? Okay." There it was, my 32-year-old son, an accomplished airline pilot who flies million-dollar machines through the sky, was genuinely worried that his simple old man might embarrass him in front of wealthy people. Leo had no idea that my monthly salary alone could probably buy one of those restaurants outright if I felt like it. To him, I was just a retired maintenance worker who had somehow scraped together just enough to survive in a quiet apartment. "Sure, son," I replied, keeping my voice as humble as possible. "I'll dust off my good shirt." "Thanks, Dad. We're meeting them Saturday evening at the Broadmoor." The Broadmoor. I knew that place well. I had hosted massive corporate dinners in their ballrooms and signed million-dollar contracts in their private conference rooms over the years. But Leo didn't know that side of my life. After we hung up, I stood in my living room and looked at my worn-out sofa, the basic television, and the bare walls. I had raised Leo to understand that a person's worth came from their character, not their bank balance. But it seemed that somewhere along the way he had started seeing the world through a different lens. He was now embarrassed by the man who had given him everything. I've spent 4 decades in the cutthroat world of business, and I've learned one thing that is more important than any financial strategy. You only truly see a person's real character when they believe you are beneath them. When people think you have no power to wield, no influence to grant, and nothing of value to offer them, their masks tend to slip. A slow smile spread across my face as I finished the last of my coffee. I had spent my entire career reading people, understanding what motivated them and where their weaknesses lay. I knew the restaurant industry was incredibly tough. I had signed enough energy contracts with hospitality groups over the years to know exactly how thin their margins could be. Saturday evening was going to be very interesting. The Sterling family, Chloe's parents, were about to meet Leo's father. They clearly had their own expectations about what a successful person looked like and how a simple working man should behave. I had 5 days to prepare for this little encounter, 5 days to decide exactly how I wanted this meeting to go. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. On Tuesday afternoon, I sat down at my laptop, nothing fancy, just a basic Dell I'd picked up 3 years ago, and started my research. I began digging into the Sterling Restaurant Group. Their website was polished and very professional, highlighting 8 locations across Colorado, from the busy streets of Denver to the high-end resorts in Vail. It was filled with the usual corporate speak about excellence in hospitality and serving the community with pride. However, the local business journals told a much more detailed story. The patriarch, Lorenzo Sterling, had started with a single diner in Pueblo and worked his way up through some very smart acquisitions and strategic locations. An article in the Denver Post from last year mentioned that their gross revenue was approaching $800,000 annually. That is certainly respectable, but it wasn't exactly Fortune 500 territory. I bookmarked several articles and memorized the key details. 8 restaurants, 37 years in business, and a recent, somewhat risky expansion into the ski resort market. These people weren't billionaires, but they had clearly done well enough to develop some very strong opinions about who belonged at their table and who didn't. They were the kind of people who measured worth by the label on a suit or the emblem on a car. Wednesday morning, I went to my storage closet and began hunting for clothes I hadn't touched in years. Buried behind some old Christmas decorations and boxes of tax returns, I found exactly what I was looking for. My original work shirts from the wind farms. They were made of faded blue cotton and still bore the permanent stains from hydraulic fluid and years of honest labor. I found my old steel-toed boots, 2 heavy Timberlands that had seen real weather and real work. When I tried them on, they still fit perfectly, though they felt heavy and strange after years of wearing business casual attire. Standing in front of the mirror, I saw a completely different man. I looked like someone who worked with his hands, someone who probably worried about getting enough overtime and counted every dollar at the end of the week. It was like stepping back in time to the person I had been before the big promotions and the corner office. On Thursday, I actually practiced my role. It sounds ridiculous, but I worked on my posture. I walked differently in those heavy boots, dropping my shoulders and softening my voice. I practiced adding a bit of hesitation to my speech, replacing my natural executive confidence with the quiet humility of someone who was just grateful for whatever kindness came his way. I wanted to be ready for the moment I walked into the Broadmoor. I wanted to see exactly who the Sterlings were when they thought they were looking at a man with nothing to offer. Friday evening arrived, and with it came one last phone call from my son. I was in my small kitchen, stirring a pot of basic macaroni and cheese, the ultimate comfort food for a man who didn't feel like cooking a 5-course meal for himself. Leo's voice was buzzing with a nervous energy that was almost painful to hear. "Dad, I just wanted to give you a few more details about tomorrow so you're ready," he said, his words coming out in a rush. The Sterling family, they're really something. Lorenzo owns 8 restaurants, and his wife, Cordelia, manages all the operations. They have this massive house in Cherry Hills Village and they drive matching silver BMWs. I kept my voice neutral, letting him talk while I moved the cheese sauce around. Chloe says they're very generous people, but they have extremely high standards. They believe in success, Dad. In building something meaningful with your life. Sounds like good, hardworking people, Leo? I said carefully, testing the waters. They are, he insisted. I just really want everything to go smoothly tomorrow night. It's important to me. After we hung up, I sat at my small table and wrestled with a bit of doubt. Was I being unfair to these people? Maybe the Sterlings would surprise me. Maybe they would look past my faded clothes and treat a retired maintenance worker with the same genuine respect they'd show a fellow CEO. But Leo's words kept echoing in my head. High standards, success, building something meaningful. Those are often code words in certain circles. They are polite ways of saying that they measure a human being by their bank account, their professional title, and their status on paper. I felt a pang of sadness as I realized that I had raised my son to be better than that. I had tried to teach him that a man's worth is found in his integrity, not his investments. Somewhere along the way, I had failed to make that lesson stick. Saturday morning was gray and biting cold, a typical November day in Colorado. I dressed slowly and with great deliberation. I put on the old work shirt with its faint stains, the faded jeans that had seen better days, and the heavy boots that had walked through miles of mud and industrial machinery. I reached for my simplest wallet, a black leather one that was worn thin and cracked at the edges. Inside, I placed exactly $43 in cash and a basic debit card from a local bank. However, hidden in a deep pocket behind the cash, barely visible to the naked eye, was another card entirely. It was heavy, made of black metal, with my name embossed in silver letters. Arthur Miller, Regional Director. That card would stay hidden until I decided otherwise. The drive from Denver to Colorado Springs usually takes about 90 minutes. I used that time to complete my transformation from a high-level executive to Artie, the retired guy who had fixed wind turbines for 30 years. I pulled my old Honda Civic onto I-25 South and watched the snow-capped mountains rise up ahead of me. Somewhere nestled in those peaks was the Broadmoor, where the people who might soon be my family were waiting to judge the man who had raised my son. It was time to see who they really were. The Broadmoor appeared like a palace from another century. The lawns were manicured into perfect lines, the fountains sparkled under the evening lights, and the circular drive was packed with luxury vehicles. I saw BMWs, Mercedes, and a few sleek Teslas. My 10-year-old Honda looked like a rusty bucket among a herd of thoroughbreds. I deliberately parked in the farthest corner of the lot, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, and stepped out. The work shirt hung loosely on me, and my boots were scuffed and practical. I was ready. Walking toward the entrance, I felt the weight of the place. The lobby was a masterclass in wealth. Marble floors, massive crystal chandeliers, and the soft, muffled murmur of people who never have to check their bank balances. Guests glided past me in designer gowns and tailored suits, their conversations filled with talk of upcoming ski seasons and private wine collections. I felt every eye in that lobby cataloging my appearance. I could almost see the mental files being created, placing me under the category of doesn't belong. Dad! Leo's voice cut through the ambient music. He approached me quickly, with Chloe by his side. My son looked sharp in a navy blazer. He looked every inch the successful airline pilot he was. But his smile was forced, and his shoulders were as tense as a coiled spring. You made good time, he said, though he didn't quite meet my eyes. Traffic wasn't too bad, I replied simply. I turned to Chloe and extended my hand. You must be Chloe. Leo hasn't stopped talking about you. She shook my hand briefly. Her grip was polite but distant, and her smile was the kind of practiced expression flight attendants use for passengers who are being a bit difficult. She wore a cream-colored dress that I knew, from years of buying gifts for my late wife, probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. My parents are already at the table, she said, gesturing toward the high-end restaurant. They're very excited to meet you. We walked through long corridors lined with expensive oil paintings and fresh floral arrangements. Other guests nodded to Leo and Chloe but ignored me completely. I might as well have been a ghost or a member of the janitorial staff. The restaurant itself was beautiful. All dark wood, soft lighting, and tables spaced far enough apart to ensure private conversations. In a quiet corner near the windows, which overlooked the darkening golf course, sat the Sterlings. Lorenzo was a large man with silver hair and an air of absolute confidence. His suit fit so perfectly it had clearly been tailored specifically for him. Beside him sat Cordelia, elegant in emerald silk and jewelry that caught every flicker of candlelight in the room. They looked up as we approached, and I watched the subtle shift in their expressions. Lorenzo's welcoming smile flickered for a fraction of a second. Cordelia's eyes swept over my old shirt, my scuffed boots, and my general appearance with a speed that was impressive. The assessment was instant, thorough, and unmistakably dismissive. "Mom, Dad," Chloe said smoothly, "this is Leo's father, Arthur Miller." Lorenzo stood and extended his hand. His grip was the firm, practiced handshake of a businessman, but it was incredibly brief. "Arthur, pleasure to meet you. I'm Lorenzo. This is my wife, Cordelia." Cordelia offered her hand as if she were bestowing a grand favor upon me. "How lovely to finally meet Leo's father," she said, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness. The waiter appeared and guided us to our seats. Somehow, I ended up in the one chair that faced away from the beautiful mountain view, the chair with a slight, annoying wobble. The others settled into plush, comfortable seats with perfect sightlines of the scenery. "Beautiful evening," I said, trying to break the ice as I looked around the opulent dining room. "This is quite a place." "We come here quite often," Lorenzo replied, settling his linen napkin over his lap. "The Broadmoor maintains certain standards that we appreciate." The menus arrived, heavy, leather-bound folders with the items written in elegant, flowing script. There were no prices listed, which is the international signal for, if you have to ask, you shouldn't be here. "The wine list here is truly exceptional," Cordelia remarked, flipping through the pages with interest. "We're actually thinking of adding some of these selections to our own restaurants. 8 locations now," Lorenzo added, his voice full of pride. "Started with one little diner in Pueblo and built it into something substantial." Leo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dad used to work in energy," he said, trying to find a bridge for the conversation. "Wind farms, mostly." "How interesting," Cordelia said, though her tone suggested it was the least interesting thing she had ever heard. "That must have been very demanding work." The waiter returned, pen poised over his pad. "Can I start you with cocktails this evening?" Lorenzo ordered a $25 scotch without blinking. Cordelia chose a wine from a bottle that I knew cost more than I spent on a month's worth of food. Leo and Chloe followed suit with their own premium selections. "Just water for me?" I said with a humble smile. "Ice water is just fine." The waiter nodded and vanished. An awkward, heavy silence settled over our table, broken only by the distant, polite clink of silverware from the other guests. Lorenzo cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto mine. "So, Arthur," he began, the question hanging in the air like an expensive cloud of cologne. "Tell us a bit about yourself." The question Lorenzo Sterling had posed hung in the air like a thick, expensive cloud of cigar smoke. I waited for a beat, folding my weathered hands over the pristine white tablecloth, feeling the heavy silence of the dining room pressing in on us. I could see the anticipation in their eyes, the curiosity of people looking at a puzzle they had already decided wasn't worth solving. "Well, I spent the better part of my career doing maintenance work," I began, keeping my voice low and humble. "I worked at energy facilities, mostly wind farms scattered across Colorado and Wyoming. I spent a lot of my days keeping the turbines spinning, making sure the power stayed on. It was honest work, though certainly nothing glamorous or fancy." Lorenzo nodded, his eyes already glazing over as he placed me in a mental box. "Wind energy. Yes, that's a growing field these days," he said with the detached tone of a man reading a headline. "Clean power is good for the environment, I suppose." I felt lucky to be part of something that felt meaningful, I added quietly. Cordelia leaned forward, her emerald earrings catching the soft light of the chandelier and throwing green sparks across the table. "Oh, how practical," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of manufactured sympathy. "But all that manual labor, it must have been so physically demanding on you." The way she whispered the words manual labor made it sound like I was describing a chronic illness rather than a career. I didn't mind it, I replied, maintaining my mask. There's a real satisfaction in knowing how things work and keeping them running. Chloe spoke up then, her voice honey-sweet but laced with a stinging condescension. It's really so admirable how you embrace such a simple lifestyle, Arthur. Not everyone has the capacity to appreciate minimalism the way you do. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his plush chair, his eyes darting between me and his future in-laws. Dad's always been very independent, he interjected, though it sounded more like an apology than a compliment. Independence is a fine quality. Lorenzo cut in smoothly, raising his expensive scotch in a mock toast. But as we get older, we all need family support. That's what makes us human, after all. The appetizers arrived then, delicate, tiny arrangements of food that looked more like modern art than a meal. I had chosen the simplest salad on the menu, yet I knew it was likely priced higher than a full three-course dinner at a local diner. So, you're fully retired now, I take it? Lorenzo continued his interrogation, his knife and fork poised over a plate of artisanal greens. Living on a fixed income? I imagine I get by, I said, taking a slow sip of my ice water. I've never been a man who needed much to be happy. Cordelia made a soft, clicking sound with her tongue, a noise of pity. Denver winters can be so harsh, especially for someone your age living all alone. The heating bills alone must be a struggle. I manage just fine, I said, keeping my expression neutral. I just keep the thermostat a little lower and wear an extra sweater. Leo stared down at his plate, his face turning a deep shade of red. He was mortified, clearly wishing he could disappear through the marble floor. Chloe, noticing his discomfort, placed a possessive hand on his arm and turned her gaze back to me. I just worry about Leo having to take on additional responsibilities, Chloe said softly, her voice pitched for maximum concern. He works so incredibly hard as a pilot. All those long flights and the pressure of passenger safety. A pilot's schedule is demanding enough without having to worry about extra concerns. The word concerns landed on the table like a lead weight. She didn't have to say it out loud. She meant me. In her eyes, I wasn't Leo's father. I was a liability, a distraction, an aging man who would eventually become a burden that her successful husband would have to manage. Lorenzo cleared his throat, sensing the moment was right to deliver his prepared speech. Family is everything to us, Arthur. When we built our restaurant group, we did it with legacy in mind. We wanted to create something substantial that would last for generations. 8 locations now, and we're still growing. That's very impressive, I said. And for once, I wasn't acting. Building a business from a single diner is no small feat. The restaurant business teaches you a lot about value and quality, Lorenzo continued, his voice gaining strength. You learn very quickly to recognize what lasts and what simply doesn't. His eyes swept over my old work shirt again, making it very clear which category he thought I belonged in. I took a bite of my salad, letting the silence stretch. Around us, the room hummed with the sounds of high society, the soft clinking of crystal and the laughter of people who had never once wondered if they could afford their heating bill. We believe that families should take care of each other, Arthur, Lorenzo said, his gaze becoming more direct and piercing. Don't you agree? I suppose they should, I replied carefully. The main courses arrived with theatrical precision, several servers in crisp uniforms presenting our plates as if they were precious artifacts. Lorenzo's steak was a massive cut that likely cost more than my monthly electricity bill. Cordelia's salmon was a work of art, garnished with greens I couldn't even name. My own chicken breast, the most modest and affordable option on the menu, still arrived with enough garnish to feed a small family. Exactly, Lorenzo said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. And that's why Cordelia and I wanted to have this talk with you tonight. We have been blessed with a great deal of success, and we believe in sharing that blessing. He paused to chew, letting the weight of his generosity settle over the table. Cordelia dabbed her lips with her silk napkin. We've given this a lot of thought, Arthur. We want to offer you a monthly stipend. Nothing too extravagant, of course, but enough to make sure you are comfortable. Perhaps $500 or $600 a month, Lorenzo added, his tone suggesting he was offering me the keys to a kingdom. I realized the amount was perfectly calculated. It was enough to sound generous to them, but not enough to actually change a person's life. It was just enough to make me grateful, dependent, and, most importantly, manageable. That is very kind of you, I said quietly, playing my role to the hilt. But I really couldn't accept charity. It's not charity, Lorenzo snapped, his voice rising slightly. It's a family investment. We're investing in Leo's peace of mind and Chloe's happiness. When they don't have to worry about your situation, they can focus entirely on building their future together. And in return, Cordelia added with a smile that was as sharp as a razor, we would just ask that you give them a little space. Let them establish their own marriage and traditions without feeling obligated to check on you constantly. Young love needs room to breathe, Arthur. I looked around the table. I saw Lorenzo's smug confidence, Cordelia's practiced pity, and Chloe's cold, calculated sweetness. Then I looked at my son, who sat there torn between his loyalty to me and the crushing weight of social pressure. That is a very generous offer, I said finally, my heart heavy with the realization of who these people really were. I'll need some time to think about it. Lorenzo raised his wine glass, the liquid inside costing more than a week's worth of my groceries. Of course, take all the time you need. But just remember, Arthur, pride is a very expensive thing to hold on to. Sometimes the wisest thing a man can do is accept help when it's offered. He took a slow sip, looking at me as if I were a problem he had just successfully solved for a few $100s a month. As the dinner progressed, the air at our table grew heavy with the kind of silence that only exists when people have said everything they intended to say without actually listening to one another. The remains of our expensive main courses sat before us like evidence of a crime. It was a striking contrast of worlds. Lorenzo had barely made a dent in his $40 prime steak, leaving thick, succulent pieces of meat untouched on the side of his plate. Cordelia's designer salmon, which had arrived looking like a masterpiece of culinary art, was now just a collection of flakes and microgreens that had been pushed around the plate more than they had been eaten. I, on the other hand, had finished nearly every bite of my chicken breast. It wasn't because it was the best chicken I had ever tasted, though it was quite good, but because of a habit I had formed as a boy. I grew up in a household where you cleaned your plate because you weren't entirely sure where the next meal was coming from. That kind of upbringing stays with you no matter how many zeros are in your bank account. Chloe dabbed her lips with her pristine white cloth napkin, leaving a faint, perfect trace of coral-colored lipstick on the fabric. That was truly wonderful, she sighed, leaning back with a look of practiced contentment. The portions here are always so generous that I can barely move. Lorenzo nodded, looking satisfied with himself, as if he personally were responsible for the kitchen's output. Indeed, the Broadmoor never disappoints when it comes to quality and quantity. Cordelia caught the eye of our waiter with a subtle, practiced movement of her hand, the kind of gesture wealthy people spend years perfecting to summon service without ever having to raise their voice. When the young man arrived, his posture straight and professional, she gave him a thin smile. "Excuse me, could you please box up these leftovers?" she asked, gesturing toward the various plates on the table. "Of course, ma'am," the waiter replied, reaching for the dishes. "All of them?" "Yes, please," Cordelia said. Then, she turned her gaze toward me. Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile one gives to a stray dog they've decided to feed. "Arthur, you really should take these home with you. Waste not, want not, right?" The restaurant seemed to fall silent in that moment, or perhaps it was just the blood rushing in my ears. I could feel the eyes of the other diners turning toward our table. To any outsider, the scene was clear. A well-dressed, affluent family was charitably offering their scraps to the shabby, elderly man sitting with them. This food probably cost more than... Cordelia paused for a moment, letting the implication hang in the air with a delicate, cruel precision. "Well, you understand. It would be a shame for it to go into the trash," She spoke loud enough that the couple at the neighboring table, a pair who looked like they stepped out of a luxury travel magazine, actually stopped their conversation to glance over. I saw the woman's eyes sweep over my faded work shirt and my weathered, calloused hands. She whispered something to her husband, her face softening with a look of, so sad. But at least they're helping. Leo's face flushed a deep, angry red. Cordelia, that's really not. Oh, don't be silly, Leo. It's only practical. Chloe interrupted smoothly, her voice dripping with a false, honey-sweet kindness. Arthur probably appreciates not having to worry about cooking for the next few days. Don't you, Arthur? I felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. The waiter stood there, frozen with a stack of plates, looking incredibly uncomfortable as he waited for my reaction. He was a young man, probably working his way through college, and I could see the embarrassment for me reflected in his eyes. That is very thoughtful of you, I managed to say, the words feeling like dry sawdust in my mouth. Thank you. The waiter moved with an almost frantic efficiency then, as if trying to end the awkward scene as quickly as possible. He carefully transferred the remnants of the meal, the expensive steak, the salmon, even the untouched artisan bread rolls and the herb-infused butter, into plain styrofoam containers. We always make it a point to take care of our family, Arthur, Lorenzo said, his voice booming slightly as if he wanted the entire dining room to hear his proclamation of virtue. That's just the kind of people we are. The subtext of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was publicly announcing that I was a charity case, a man so poor he was grateful for the scraps from their table. I watched the waiter's hands shake slightly as he sealed the last container and placed them into a large bag. There you go, sir, the waiter said quietly, placing the bag on the floor beside my chair. The containers made a hollow, clinking sound as they settled. A sound that, in my mind, echoed like coins falling into a beggar's cup. Thank you, I repeated, my voice steady despite the cold rage that was beginning to coil in my chest. Chloe beamed at me, looking triumphant. Now you won't have to worry about your meals for a while. Isn't that wonderful? I looked at my son. Leo looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear into the carpet. His hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap, and his jaw was set with a look of pure mortification. And yet he said nothing. He did nothing to defend me. He just sat there in his navy blazer while his future in-laws stripped his father of his dignity in front of a room full of strangers. The thing about family, Cordelia continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension she had created, or perhaps she was enjoying it, is that we support each other through the difficult times. She adjusted one of her diamond bracelets. Some people are far too proud to accept help when they need it, but real family doesn't let pride get in the way of practical needs. The waiter returned a few moments later, carrying a black leather folder which he placed carefully beside Lorenzo's elbow. It was the check. Even from my position across the table, I could see the total through the small transparent pocket. It was $1,850. Lorenzo reached for the folder with the casual, bored confidence of a man who had never once had to wonder if he had enough money to pay for a meal. He didn't even bother to look at the itemized list of charges. This one is on us, he announced, looking around the table with a magnanimous grin. A family celebration. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out a platinum card, the kind of high-limit card banks only reserve for their most elite and valued customers. He slid it into the presenter with a flourish, signaling the waiter with a sharp, confident nod. The young man returned quickly with a portable card reader in hand. Lorenzo inserted the card, already reaching for his smartphone to check his messages, convinced the transaction was just a formality. The card reader let out a short, sharp beep. Then another. The waiter's expression shifted from professional courtesy to a flicker of genuine concern. I'm sorry, sir, the waiter said, his voice low and apologetic, but this card has been declined. Lorenzo looked up, his eyes wide with shock. That's impossible, he snapped, his face beginning to redden. Try it again. The waiter complied, running the card a second time with the same result. The machine emitted that same high-pitched rejection beep. There must be some kind of system error on your end, Lorenzo said, his voice losing its confident edge and turning sharp with frustration. That card has a very high limit. It's never been declined. Cordelia leaned in close, her emerald earrings swaying. Try the business account card, Lorenzo, she whispered urgently. I sat there, watching the scene unfold. Other diners were definitely noticing the commotion now. The couple at the next table, who had just watched me be handed leftovers like a pauper, were now watching the great Lorenzo Sterling fumble through his wallet with undisguised curiosity. Lorenzo produced a second card, this one connected to his restaurant group's corporate accounts. This one has a much higher limit, he insisted, though his hands were shaking slightly now. The reader beeped its rejection once more. Sir, the waiter said quietly, leaning in so as not to draw more attention. Perhaps you could call your bank? Sometimes there are security holds on large transactions. I know how credit cards work, Lorenzo hissed, his face now a deep purple. He was frantically scrolling through banking apps on his phone, his earlier composure evaporating like steam in the cold mountain air. The silence at our table was deafening. Leo stared at his hands, unable to look at anyone. Chloe's perfect, practiced smile had frozen into a mask of pure terror. Cordelia was whispering suggestions that grew more desperate with every failed attempt to fix the situation. I looked at the bag of leftovers at my feet. Then I looked at the man who had just tried to buy my dignity for $500 a month. Perhaps I could help, I said quietly. The silence at our table was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to push the ambient noise of the restaurant into the far distance. All eyes were on me. Lorenzo, whose face had transitioned from a deep, angry purple to a pale, waxy gray, paused his frantic scrolling through his banking apps. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope, his earlier aura of absolute authority having evaporated completely. I reached into my worn, thin leather wallet. I moved past the basic debit card that they had all assumed was my only link to a bank account. My fingers found the other card, the one I had kept tucked away in a hidden compartment. I withdrew it slowly, placing it on the white tablecloth where the candlelight could catch its surface. It wasn't plastic. It was a heavy, matte black metal card, with no visible spending limit, and my name, *Arthur Miller*, embossed in sharp, silver letters. The young waiter's entire demeanor underwent a radical transformation the moment his eyes landed on the card. He didn't just see a piece of metal. He saw a symbol of immense financial power. In a place like the Broadmoor, these cards are legendary, seen perhaps only a dozen times in a server's entire career. His back straightened, and the look of pity he had held for me just moments ago was replaced by profound, professional respect. Of course, Mr. Miller, he said, his voice now hushed and deferential. I will process this immediately. He took the card and the leather presenter to the side station. There were no beeps of rejection this time, no awkward delays, and no apologetic explanations. The transaction was processed with the quiet, clinical efficiency that comes with unlimited corporate purchasing power. Within seconds, he was back at the table, returning the card to me with a slight, respectful bow. Actually, I said, my voice now carrying the resonance of the boardroom rather than the workshop, there is something you all should probably know about me. The table fell even deeper into silence. Even the neighboring diners, who had been openly enjoying Lorenzo's earlier display of charity, seemed to lean in, their conversations dying away. I'm not exactly a retired maintenance worker, I began, keeping my tone calm and conversational. My name is Arthur Miller, and I am the Regional Director of Peak Horizon Energy. We manage wind and solar farms across 7 states, from the Rockies to the Pacific. Leo's mouth fell open, and for a moment, he looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? I've known you my whole life, and I had no idea. Because I wanted you to grow up understanding that a person's worth is never measured by the size of their paycheck, I replied, looking him directly in the eyes. I wanted you to respect people for who they are, not for what they have in the bank. I turned my gaze toward Lorenzo, who looked like he had been struck by lightning. To answer your earlier question, Lorenzo, My salary is $48,000 per month. Cordelia made a small, choked sound in the back of her throat, her hand flying to her emerald-adorned neck. But here is the truly interesting part, Lorenzo, I continued, leaning forward slightly so that only those at our table could hear the edge in my voice. I've done my homework on the Sterling Restaurant Group. You have 8 locations, industrial-grade kitchens, massive walk-in freezers, and climate control systems that run 24 hours a day. Lorenzo's eyes widened as the realization began to dawn on him. Your monthly energy bill averages about $28,000 across all your locations, I said, watching him wince at the number. And since I personally review and approve every commercial contract over $25,000, I've probably signed off on your business operations every month for the last 3 years. The silence was absolute now. I could almost see the gears turning in Lorenzo's head as he reevaluated every single thing he had said to me over the last 2 hours. You see, Lorenzo, you aren't just meeting Leo's father tonight, I said. You're having dinner with your primary energy supplier. I'm the man who signs the papers that keep your lights on, your freezers running, and your restaurants operational. I let that sink in for a moment, watching the way his confidence had completely collapsed. In fact, you are one of our most valued commercial clients. I recognized your company name the moment Leo mentioned it. Lorenzo stared at me as if I were a visitor from another planet. Cordelia's expensive jewelry suddenly looked gaudy and cheap in the harsh light of the revelation, and Chloe's confident, condescending smile had vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Leo was shaking his head in total amazement. Dad, I had no idea. All these years you thought I was just a poor old man who needed your future in-laws' charity, I said, my voice quiet but firm as I looked around the table. Someone you could help with a $600 a month allowance and a bag of doggy bag scraps. The waiter returned one last time with the receipt for me to sign. Thank you, Mr. Miller. I truly hope you enjoyed your evening, he said with a level of sincerity that hadn't been there before. It was very educational, I replied as I signed the slip and pocketed my black card. Lorenzo finally found his voice, though it was thin and cracked. Arthur. We had no idea. We never meant. We wouldn't have said those things if we had known. I stood up slowly, the heavy work boots feeling like anchors of reality in this room of pretension. I reached down and picked up the plastic bag of leftovers that Cordelia had insisted I take. No, I said quietly, looking down at the man who had tried to buy my dignity. You didn't know. And that is exactly the point. I looked at Cordelia and Chloe, whose faces were masks of shame and horror. They had seen a maintenance worker and decided he wasn't worth their respect. They had seen manual labor and decided it was a disease to be pitted. They had revealed their true hearts because they thought I had no power to strike back. This was a very revealing evening, I said, the bag of scraps crinkling in my hand. I've learned everything I need to know about the people my son is planning to join his life with. I turned to Leo, whose face was a complex map of shame and relief. I'll be in the car, son. Take your time. As I walked out of the dining room, I felt the eyes of the entire restaurant on me. I wasn't the poor old man anymore. I was the man who had just paid an $1,800 bill without blinking, the man who held the keys to the Sterling's business empire in his desk drawer. But more than that, I was a father who had just shown his son that the world's yardsticks for success are often broken, and that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the worth of a man in a faded blue shirt. The restaurant was a blur of high-end decor and hushed whispers as I turned to leave, but the weight of that plastic doggy bag in my hand felt like a ton of lead. The silence at our table was so thick you could have cut it with a steak knife. Lorenzo Sterling, the man who had been a lion of industry only minutes before, was now looking like a fish out of water, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. Cordelia's perfect makeup was still in place, but she couldn't hide the deep, angry flush of shame creeping up her neck. Even Chloe, the woman who had been so sure of herself and her standards, sat staring at the white tablecloth as if she expected a hole to open up and swallow her whole. Arthur, we had no idea, Lorenzo finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking like dry wood under pressure. We never meant. It was all just a huge misunderstanding. We were just trying to be helpful. I looked at him, and for the first time that night, I let the full weight of my executive authority show in my eyes. You assumed exactly what I wanted you to assume, Lorenzo, I said. My voice as cold and steady as a mountain stream. And by doing so, you showed me exactly who you are when you think nobody of importance is watching. You don't get to call it a misunderstanding when you treat a human being like a burden just because you think they have less money than you. Chloe looked up then, her eyes swimming with a sudden, frantic panic. Mr. Miller, I hope you don't think we were being disrespectful. We genuinely care about Leo's happiness and his future. Do you, Chloe? I asked her directly, not letting her look away. Or do you care about the pilot's salary, the social stability, and how neatly he fits into your family's polished, expensive world? The couple at the neighboring table had completely given up on pretending to eat their own meal. They were leaning in, their forks suspended in midair, as they watched the drama of the poor man turning the tables. I didn't care about the audience. I lifted the bag of leftovers from the floor beside my wobbly chair. I'll take this with me, Cordelia. It was very thoughtful of you to make sure I wouldn't go hungry tomorrow. I saw her wince as if I'd actually struck her with the words. And Lorenzo? Each month, when those energy contracts cross my desk, the ones for $28,000 that keep your 8 restaurants running, I'm going to remember this evening. I'm going to remember how you treated a man you thought had nothing to offer you. Leo stood up then, his face a complex mixture of deep shame, amazement, and something that looked like immense relief. Dad, can we talk? Privately? We walked toward the grand entrance of the restaurant, our footsteps echoing on the marble floors. When we were far enough away from the table, he stopped and looked at me, his shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. I'm so sorry, Dad, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry I was embarrassed by you. I'm sorry I didn't defend you when they were being like that. I let them treat you like a charity case because I started seeing you through their eyes instead of my own. You did try to defend me, Leo, I told him, placing a firm, fatherly hand on his shoulder. Maybe not as strongly as you could have, but you tried. That counts for something. But you have to ask yourself why you were nervous in the first place. But why the secret, Dad? He asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer he'd missed for years. The job, the $48,000 a month, the corporate power. Why didn't you ever tell me the real story? Because I wanted you to respect people for who they are, not for what they possess, I said firmly, giving him the truth I'd lived by. I wanted you to understand that a man's worth isn't something you can find in a bank account or a luxury car. I thought I had taught you that, son. I did learn it, he argued, though his voice was soft. But I got caught up in their world. I started seeing success as a requirement rather than an achievement. I was afraid they'd see you as someone who didn't matter because you chose to live simply. We returned to the table one last time to collect my things. The Sterling family looked like they had been turned into pillars of salt. I looked at Chloe, who was on the verge of tears. Leo deserves someone who loves him for the man he is, not the pilot he became, I told her quietly. If you can't be that person, let him find someone who can. To her parents, I added, you've built an impressive business, Lorenzo, but success without character is just a very expensive kind of emptiness. With that, I picked up my keys and walked out into the cold Colorado night. The drive back to Denver was silent for the first 20 minutes. The mountains rose up around us like dark giants, and below us, the city lights spread out like scattered diamonds across the plains. What happens now, Dad? Leo asked as we finally pulled into my modest apartment complex. Now you decide who you want to be, I told him as I put the car in park. Do you build a life on how things look to others or on what they actually are? If someone only loves you when you're successful, what happens when life gets hard? Because life always gets hard eventually. As he got out of the car, he looked around at my plain building and my 10-year-old Honda with entirely new eyes. You could live in a palace, Dad. Why here? Because this is enough, I said simply. I don't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to people who think a man's worth can be measured by his zip code. Looking back on that night at the Broadmoor, I realized that God had a plan for that dinner. It wasn't just about humbling the Sterlings. It was about showing my own son what true dignity looks like when it's stripped of all the fancy labels. Our Creator doesn't measure us by our job titles, but by how we treat the people we think have nothing to offer us. That night, Leo learned that my greatest wealth wasn't the money I made every month, but the values of respect and kindness I had tried to instill in him since he was a little boy. I call these my grandpa stories, the true stories of who we are when nobody is watching. They are the legacy we pass down, more valuable than any inheritance. But as I often tell Leo, life is a book with many chapters. And while the story of the Sterling family was a lesson in pride, the next chapter of my life would be a much harder lesson in betrayal. You see, I have another child, my daughter, Rachel. And while Leo was navigating the world of pilots and prestigious in-laws, Rachel was falling for a man named Silas. At the time, I thought he was just a bit rough around the edges, a guy trying to find his way. I never imagined he was a predator in a cheap suit. I never imagined that while I was teaching lessons about dignity in Colorado, Silas was back in Florida, planning to rob me of $225,000 and the only physical memories I had left of my late wife, Margaret. That dark chapter started during a fishing trip to the Florida Keys. I had gone there for 3 days of peace, needing to cast a line and let the weight of the world fade away after the chaos of losing my wife to cancer. I needed the silence of the ocean, but the peace I found on the water was a cruel illusion. When I finally pulled into my driveway on Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa, the house felt different the moment I stepped inside. It was too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for me to discover the truth. I walked into my study, and my heart didn't just drop. It stopped. The safe door, which had held 43 years of my life with Margaret, was hanging wide open. Everything was gone. Her diamond anniversary necklace, her grandmother's pearls, the wedding ring she'd worn until she passed. All gone. And the cash compartment? It was as empty as a grave. $225,000 of my retirement fund, the money Margaret and I had saved for our sunset years, vanished. I was 68 years old, and I was standing in a room that felt like it had been hollowed out. But the worst part was yet to come. When the detective arrived and examined the safe, he looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes. No scratches on the lock, he noted. No forced entry. Whoever did this had the combination. And only 3 people in the entire world had that combination. Myself, my daughter Rachel, and her husband, Silas. The weight of Detective Johnson's words felt heavier than the vault door itself. I sat in my study for hours after the police left, staring at the empty space where my life security used to reside. The house, which had been a sanctuary for Margaret and me for over 40 years, suddenly felt cold and foreign, as if the very walls were complicit in the crime. As a financial advisor for 3 decades, I was trained to look at numbers, patterns, and risks. But I had never calculated the risk of my own family being the ones to pull the rug out from under me. Detective Johnson had been blunt. He'd seen enough crime scenes to know when a lock had been picked and when it had been opened by someone with a key, or in this case, a combination. "This is an inside job," he had told me, his eyes full of a weary kind of sympathy that only comes from seeing people at their worst. He asked me who had access, and the list was heartbreakingly short. Myself, my daughter Rachel, and her husband, Silas. They had been living in the guest wing of my home for a year, seeking a bit of stability while they got on their feet. I wanted to believe Rachel would never hurt me. She was her mother's daughter, honest to a fault. And Silas? I thought he was just a bit rough around the edges, but I assumed he loved my daughter. For sleepless nights followed the discovery. I spent them pacing the hallways, replaying every conversation and every interaction in my head. Then, on a Thursday morning, the silence of our quiet Tampa street was shattered by the low, expensive rumble of a high-performance engine. I looked through the kitchen blinds and saw a silver BMW X5 glide into my driveway, its temporary tags gleaming in the Florida sun. Silas stepped out of the driver's seat with a stride that was entirely too confident for a man who, just a week ago, was driving a rattling old Civic and borrowing gas money from me. He stood there, buffing a smudge off the pristine hood, looking like he owned the entire neighborhood. My neighbor, Mr. Patterson, wandered over in his bathrobe, whistling at the sight of the luxury machine. "Beautiful machine, son," Patterson said. "Business must be treating you well." Silas puffed out his chest, leaning against the door. "Sometimes you've got to invest in yourself," he replied with a smug grin. "Rachel deserves the best." My stomach did a slow, sickening flip. The math didn't add up. Silas worked in IT support with a modest salary. A $60,000 SUV was a financial impossibility for him. Rachel burst through the front door then, her face radiant with a kind of excitement I hadn't seen since before her mother passed away. She hugged me so tight I could smell her expensive new perfume. "Dad, you won't believe it. We have the most amazing news," she squealed. "We're buying a house. A real house in Hyde Park." Hyde Park is one of the most exclusive areas in Tampa, where even the mailboxes look like they cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Before I could even process the news, I was being ushered into the leather-scented interior of the BMW and driven to a Spanish-tiled mansion on a tree-lined street. Rachel chattered on about furniture and garden plans, but I was barely listening. My eyes were locked on her neck. There, catching the light from the afternoon sun, was Margaret's diamond necklace. It was the 20th anniversary gift I had spent months saving for, the one that was supposed to be locked in my safe. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. "Rachel?" I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "That necklace." She touched the pendant, her eyes beaming with gratitude. "Isn't it beautiful? Silas said you wanted me to have it now instead of waiting. He said family heirlooms should be worn, not locked away in a dark safe. Thank you for letting him give it to me, Dad." Silas appeared behind her, sliding his arm possessively around her waist. He looked at me over her shoulder, his eyes cold and challenging, daring me to speak the truth and break my daughter's heart. He had stolen my money, stolen my wife's jewelry, and then used it as a prop to make himself look like a hero in Rachel's eyes. He had made me a silent accomplice to my own robbery. I looked at Rachel's happy face, the first bit of joy she'd had in a year of grieving, and the words died in my throat. "Of course," I managed to choke out. "Your mother would want you to wear it." But as soon as I got home, the financial advisor in me took over. I knew the police were hitting a dead end because there was no forced entry, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called David Brooks, a private investigator known for handling complex financial fraud. I told him the timeline, the fishing trip, the empty safe, and the sudden, impossible appearance of a BMW and a $90,000 house down payment. $150,000 in cash purchases within a week of your theft? Brooks mused, scratching his chin. That isn't a coincidence. That's a confession. He started digging into Silas's history, and what he found was more terrifying than a simple theft. He tracked down an old Dell laptop that Silas had abandoned at a repair shop 6 months prior. When Brooks cracked the password and opened a folder labeled Miller Research, my blood turned to ice. Inside were dozens of files. My daily routine, the layout of my house in a PDF, my 2023 fishing schedule, and high-resolution photos of my safe from multiple angles. The oldest files dated back 2 years, before Silas had even proposed to Rachel. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a long-term hunt. Every family dinner, every holiday, and every kiss he'd shared with my daughter had been a calculated move to get closer to that safe combination. He had even tracked my net worth, my insurance policies, and the estimated resale value of Margaret's jewelry. "Mr. Miller," Brooks said quietly, showing me the screen, "your daughter isn't his wife. She's his cover story. She was the key he used to walk into your life and clean you out." A cold, sharp rage began to burn in my chest. Silas thought he was the smartest man in the room because he had studied my vulnerabilities. But he had forgotten one thing. I had spent 35 years studying people just like him. He had planned his crime with spreadsheets and surveillance, but he was about to learn that a financial advisor knows how to balance the books, and I was going to make sure his balance ended at zero. I looked at the photo of Margaret on my desk and made a silent promise. I wasn't just going to get the money back. I was going to dismantle Silas's life with the same cold, legal precision he had used to dismantle mine. The revelation that Silas was not just a thief, but a serial predator, changed the entire nature of my mission. It was no longer just about the money he had taken from my safe. It was about the path of destruction he had left behind in other cities, and the realization that my daughter was currently the target of his latest project. David Brooks, my private investigator, sat across from me in his office, spreading out a series of folders that felt like the files of a hunter. This level of planning, as Brooks pointed out, was rare and terrifying. Silas didn't just happen upon his victims. He groomed them with the patience of a professional. The first folder was labeled Eleanor Walsh, from Savannah, Georgia. She was a 62-year-old widow who had recently lost her husband to a sudden heart attack. Her daughter, a kind woman who was eager to find a companion after her father's death, had brought home a charming man named Samuel Brooks. Brooks described how Samuel had courted the daughter for 8 months, eventually moving into Eleanor's guest house and gaining her absolute trust. One weekend, while Eleanor was visiting her sister in Atlanta, her safe was completely emptied. $150,000 in cash and family jewelry, going back 4 generations, vanished into thin air. Samuel disappeared that same day, leaving only a short note saying he had a job offer in California. Eleanor's friends said she never recovered from the shame and betrayal. She passed away only 6 months later. The second case was even more haunting. Patricia Williams, a widow in Charlotte, North Carolina, whose husband had been a decorated Korean War veteran. Her daughter, Jennifer, met Samuel at a coffee shop near the hospital where she worked as a nurse. The pattern was identical. A whirlwind romance, moving into the family home, and earning the mother's trust. Patricia lost $200,000, her entire life savings, along with her late husband's Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals. Samuel vanished the day before Jennifer's birthday. As I looked at the photos of these women, I saw the same trusting smile that Rachel had worn when she showed me that stolen necklace. Silas, or Samuel, or whatever his real name was, used love as a master key to unlock homes. He didn't see Rachel as a wife. He saw her as a cover story and a way into my assets. I felt a cold, sharp rage burning through me, but I knew that violence wasn't the answer. It would only make me like him and wouldn't bring justice to the families in Savannah and Charlotte. I told Brooks that I was going to destroy him, but I was going to do it legally and methodically, the same way I had managed financial portfolios for 35 years. The next step took me to the downtown Tampa office of Marcus Webb, a corporate litigator who specialized in high-stakes financial disputes. Webb was the kind of man who viewed the law as a chess match. He reviewed Brooks's files and agreed that the best revenge would be a slow, legal tightening of the noose. He pulled up Silas's financial profile and found a weak point: an outstanding tax debt from 2022 and 2023 totaling $8,500 that had been unpaid for 18 months. "Can I buy that debt?" I asked. Webb smiled. "It was the first move in our game. We created an anonymous LLC called Desert Peak Holdings and purchased the tax lien." Suddenly, I wasn't just Silas's father-in-law. I was his creditor. But the financial pressure didn't stop there. Webb explained that the IRS is always interested in anonymous tips regarding unreported income, especially when a person makes large cash purchases that don't match their declared salary. We submitted Form 3949A, highlighting Silas's $80,000 in cash transactions, the BMW and the house down payment. Despite his modest $55,000 annual salary, it was a completely untraceable tip that would trigger a massive audit. Finally, I reached out to FBI agent Rebecca Thompson, who was already investigating the interstate fraud cases in Georgia and North Carolina. Our evidence was the missing link she needed to build a federal case. By April, the trap began to close. The IRS demanded documentation for Silas's recent spending, and the pressure was visible from my kitchen window. I watched Silas pacing the driveway, his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing frantically as his world of lies began to crack. He had to hire a high-priced tax attorney at $300 an hour, paying the $5,000 retainer out of the very house fund he had stolen from me. In May, Desert Peak Holdings, my anonymous company, demanded the $12,000 in original debt plus interest and fees, giving him 30 days to pay or face asset seizure. The stress began to poison his relationship with Rachel. During her visits, she confided in me that Silas was drinking more, snapping at her over tiny expenses, and constantly looking over his shoulder. She caught him frantically going through financial papers late at night. "He says someone knows about us, Dad," she told me, her voice trembling with worry. "He said we might need to run." It was a perfect irony. Silas knew he was being hunted, but he had no idea that the hunter was sitting right across from his wife, offering her a glass of tea while I tightened the noose. The paranoia was setting in, and Silas was becoming desperate. He was no longer the smug man buffing a silver BMW. He was a cornered rat who realized that his past was catching up to him, though he still didn't know exactly who was pulling the strings. I told Rachel to stay with me for a few days if she felt unsafe, knowing that the final confrontation was only a matter of time. The game was almost over, and Silas was about to find out that when you steal from a man who understands how to track every cent, you don't just lose the money, you lose everything. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or a dark alley. It happened in the entryway of the home I had shared with Margaret for most of my life. It was a Thursday evening, around 8:30 p.m., when a violent pounding shook my front door. The force of it was enough to make the windows rattle in their frames. A desperate and angry sound that told me exactly who was on the other side. I had been expecting this for weeks, ever since my anonymous company, Desert Peak Holdings, had started squeezing Silas for every cent he owed. Through the peephole, I saw his face, distorted by a primal rage, his hair a mess, and a bundle of legal documents clutched tightly in his shaking fist. I opened the door with a calm that seemed to infuriate him even more. "Good evening, Silas. Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, keeping my voice as light as if he were just a neighbor stopping by to borrow a cup of sugar. He didn't wait for an invitation. He shoved past me into the foyer, waving the papers in the air like they were weapons. "Cut the act, old man," he screamed, his voice cracking with the pressure of his crumbling world. "I know you're the one behind all of this. The harassment, the bills, all of it." He thrust a demand letter from Desert Peak Holdings toward my face. $12,000 for some tax debt I settled years ago, and now the IRS is crawling all over me for money I supposedly never made. "You think I'm stupid? You're trying to destroy me." I walked calmly into the living room and sat in my favorite armchair, gesturing for him to take a seat. He wouldn't. He paced back and forth like a caged animal, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for a way out. "Silas, I run a very small financial consulting firm," I said neutrally. "I have no idea what this Desert Peak company is." "Liar," he spat, and I could see the literal spray of his anger. "You've been sabotaging my life from the start. You're trying to destroy my marriage because you never liked me." "Your marriage seems to be doing fine, Silas," I replied, watching him closely. "Rachel was just here yesterday, showing me the furniture she picked out for your new Hyde Park mansion." That mention of the house seemed to snap the last thread of his composure. His face went pale, then flushed a deep, ugly red. All the charm he had used to woo my daughter vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. "You should have just died with your wife," he snarled, the words dripping with venom. "At least then Rachel would have inherited everything the legal way, instead of me having to work so hard to get it." I leaned back, studying him with the detached interest of a scientist looking at a bug. "Interesting choice of words, Silas. Work for it?" I asked quietly. "Is that what you call stealing $225,000 in cash and all of Margaret's jewelry from my safe while I was away fishing?" He froze. His mouth opened and closed, but for a second, no sound came out. He looked like he was suffocating on his own lies. You can't prove that," he finally whispered. "I don't have to prove it, Silas," I said, my voice as hard as granite. "Because I know about Eleanor Walsh in Savannah. I know about the $150,000 and the 4 generations of jewelry you took from her. I know about Patricia Williams in Charlotte, the $200,000 you stole, And the war medals you took from a veteran's widow. Silas stumbled backward until his back hit the wall. How do you? I know about your old laptop, Samuel, I said, using the name he had tried so hard to bury. The Miller research folder was very educational. 2 years of surveillance photos, my fishing schedules, the floor plans of this very house. You've been hunting me since the day you met my daughter. You're insane, he whispered. But the fight had completely drained out of his body. You can't prove a thing. The FBI disagrees, I told him, pulling my phone from my pocket. Agent Rebecca Thompson sends her regards. She's been looking for the link between the Savannah and Charlotte cases for a long time. Imagine her excitement when I gave her your name and a digital copy of your research files. Just then, the front door opened, and Rachel's voice called out cheerfully from the foyer. Dad? I saw Silas's car in the driveway. Are you two having a nice talk? She walked into the room, still wearing her work scrubs, her smile fading the moment she saw us. She saw Silas pressed against the wall like a cornered rat, the legal papers scattered on the floor, and the heavy, dark tension in the air. What's going on? She asked, her eyes darting back and forth. Silas, you look like you've seen a ghost. Dad, why do you both look so serious? Silas tried to speak, but he was finished. The weight of his own exposure had finally crushed him. Rachel, I said gently, I need you to look at something. I handed her my phone, which was already open to the photos of Silas's surveillance work. I showed her the files created 2 years ago, long before they were even engaged. She scrolled through images of our kitchen, my study, and our daily schedules. Her face went ashen. This is our house, Silas, she whispered, her voice cracking. Why do you have pictures of Dad's study from 2 years ago? I told her about Eleanor and Patricia. I told her about the daughters who thought they had found the love of their lives, only to realize they were being used as keys to their parents' safes. Silas dropped to his knees beside the couch, trying to grab her hands. Rachel, I made mistakes in the past, but I changed. I love you. This isn't like the other times. Other times, Rachel shrieked, pulling her hands away as if his touch were poison. How many families have you destroyed, Silas? She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. Dad, the insurance papers for the house loan? Were they real? They weren't insurance papers, sweetheart, I told her. They were loan applications. He used your credit to borrow money while he spent the cash he stole from me. Rachel stood up slowly, her face hardening into a mask of resolve I had never seen before. She looked at the diamond necklace she was wearing, the one she thought was a gift of love, and her hand went to her throat as if the diamonds were burning her skin. Everything is stolen, she whispered. Rachel, please, Silas began, but she didn't let him finish. Get out, she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. Baby, please let me explain. Get out, she screamed with such raw power that Silas actually stumbled backward toward the door. Get out of this house. Get out of my life. He looked between us, his mind clearly racing for one last lie, one last way to salvage his plan. But he saw the truth in our eyes. It was over. This isn't the end, he snarled, his eyes full of hate as he backed toward the exit. Actually, it is, I replied, holding up my phone one last time. Agent Thompson and the local police will be here in less than an hour. If I were you, I'd use that time to decide exactly what you're going to tell them. An hour later, the driveway was filled with the blue and red strobe lights of police cruisers. Agent Thompson arrived with a briefcase full of evidence. And for the next 3 hours, Rachel and I sat on the couch and told her everything. We documented the thefts, the surveillance, and the lies. Rachel's voice shook as she realized she had been an accidental accessory to her own father's robbery, but she didn't hold back. 2 days later, they caught him at a cheap motel near the airport, clutching a fake passport and trying to book a flight to Mexico. The man who had tried to steal my future was finally in handcuffs, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The federal courthouse in downtown Tampa is a cold, imposing structure of glass and steel, a place where the gravity of the law feels like a physical weight on your shoulders. In July, when the trial of Samuel Brooks, the man we knew as Silas, finally began, the Florida heat outside was stifling, but inside the courtroom, the air was chilled and clinical. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my hand resting firmly on Rachel's as we waited for the proceedings to start. I wasn't the only one seeking answers that day. 2 other women sat nearby, their faces etched with a mixture of pain and anticipation. One was the daughter of Eleanor Walsh, who had flown all the way from Savannah, Georgia, still carrying the grief of her mother's passing 18 months after Silas had robbed them. The other was Jennifer, the daughter of Patricia Williams from Charlotte, who sat clutching a small, framed photograph of her father in his military uniform, the same man whose war medal Silas had callously stolen and likely sold for a quick profit. When Rachel took the stand, the room went silent. She looked smaller in that witness box, still wearing her hospital scrubs as if to remind herself of the life she was working to rebuild. Her voice was quiet but steady as she described the systematic manipulation. She told the court how Silas had isolated her from her friends, how he had hurried her into signing piles of insurance documents that were actually high-interest loans, and how he had used my wife's stolen jewelry to create a fantasy of a shared future. The prosecutor was relentless. He painted a picture of a man who didn't just steal money, but who treated human hearts like disposable tools for his own enrichment. Silas's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had genuinely changed, and that his feelings for Rachel were real, but the argument withered the moment the Miller research files were presented on the large courtroom screens. 2 years of digital surveillance, photos of my safe, my house plans, and my schedules showed the world that Silas's love was nothing more than a well-executed heist. Judge Harrison didn't mince words when the time for sentencing arrived. He looked down at Silas, who was slumped in his chair, the smug confidence of the silver BMW days long gone. "Mr. Brooks," the judge said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "you have systematically dismantled the lives of families across multiple states. You didn't just steal currency. You stole their security and their ability to trust." He sentenced Silas to 8 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime of restitution payments. The process of financial recovery was swift but bittersweet. The court ordered the immediate seizure and auction of Silas's assets. The silver BMW X5, which he had buffed with such pride in my driveway, sold for $42,000. The luxury house in Hyde Park, with its beautiful Spanish tiles and bay windows that had once been the center of Rachel's dreams, was sold for $380,000 to cover the unpaid mortgage and debts. By the time the dust settled, I had recovered $165,000 of my stolen retirement savings. It wasn't the full amount, but it was enough to ensure I wouldn't have to change my simple way of life. More importantly, the families of Eleanor Walsh and Patricia Williams received $60,000 and $75,000 respectively. It wouldn't bring back Eleanor's health or Patricia's husband's medals, but it was a measure of justice they never thought they would see. As the deputies led Silas away in handcuffs, he paused for a split second, his eyes searching for Rachel in the gallery. For a moment, I saw the old predator trying to find a way back in, trying to spark some flicker of the old devotion. But Rachel didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of iron resolve. She wasn't his victim anymore. She was his survivor. Outside the courthouse, the Tampa humidity hit us like a wall. Rachel took my arm as we walked toward my truck. "Dad," she said softly, looking at the city skyline. "I know this might sound strange, but could I move back home for a while? I need some time to remember who I am when I'm not being told who to be." I squeezed her hand tight. "Sweetheart, that house has always been your home." The months that followed were a season of quiet healing. By February, the gentle Florida warmth had returned, and the garden at the back of the house was thriving. Rachel had spent her weekends planting herbs, basil, rosemary, and thyme. Simple things that required nothing but sun, water, and patience to grow. "Dad, the mint is trying to take over the whole garden again," she called out one afternoon, laughing as she wrestled with a stubborn green vine. "I think I need to transplant it before it conquers everything." I looked up from my book, enjoying the sound of her genuine laughter. Some things need clear boundaries to thrive, Rachel, I replied. She caught my eye and nodded, the metaphor landing exactly where it needed to. We had spent hours talking about boundaries, not just in gardens but in life and in the heart. Rachel had found a new purpose, working at a local nonprofit that helped victims of financial fraud navigate the complex world of recovery. She used her experience to teach others that trust but verify isn't a cynical way to live, but a necessary one. She had even started her own modest savings account, insisting on absolute financial independence. One evening, as we prepared a lasagna using my late wife Margaret's old recipe, Rachel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, Dad, I used to think that love meant being blind to someone's flaws. I thought Mom never questioned you because she just believed everything you said. Couldn't help but chuckle. Oh, your mother questioned me plenty, Rachel. But she did it with the wisdom of 43 years. She trusted me because I earned it every single day, through actions, not just words. Trust is built over time. It's not a gift you just hand out to a stranger. Looking back on these two very different experiences, the night at the Broadmoor with the Sterling family and the long road to justice with Silas, I realized that they were both chapters in the same book. One was a lesson in the arrogance of wealth, and the other was a lesson in the danger of misplaced trust. Both taught me that the only currency that truly matters in this world is character. I call these my grandpa stories. They are the true tales of the heart that I pass down to my son Leo and my daughter Rachel, not to make them cynical, but to make them wise. I want them to remember that God doesn't judge us by the numbers in our bank accounts or the titles on our business cards. He measures us by how we treat those we think have nothing to offer us, and how we protect the truth when the world tries to bury it in lies. Success, as I've learned, isn't meant to lift us above others. It's meant to give us the tools to do what is right. Whether I'm sitting in my modest Denver apartment or my Tampa home, I know that my greatest wealth isn't the $48,000 monthly salary or the recovered retirement fund. It's the fact that my children now understand that dignity is earned through integrity, and that justice, while sometimes slow, is as certain as the rising sun. Families can bend under the weight of betrayal, and they can be tested by the fires of humiliation, but they don't have to break if they stand on a foundation of honesty. Rachel is thriving now, Leo is a man of substance, and I am simply a father who is grateful that the truth finally found its way home. Every true story has an ending, but the lessons they leave behind become the legacy for the next generation. Never judge a book by its cover, and never assume that the person you're dismissing isn't the one holding the keys to your future. Character is the only thing we take with us when we leave this world, so make sure yours is worth the journey.